neat tags that named old lives. He stopped only briefly and then let the thought go. It was not the sound of glass that haunted him most as he walked away. It was the small absence within himself, the steady hole of a shadow he could not find, and the sense that his choice would not make it return. He bent his head against the fog and kept moving, because in the end the only thing to be done was the slow, ordinary labor of asking people to hold what they had been given, to accept what they had lost, and to carry with them, together, the weight of all those days. Even as the quay swallowed the small sounds behind him, Jonna could not help thinking that tonight, when he lay beneath the lamplight in the little room he rented above the fish stall, the ledger would be there on the table like a small plea. He would open it, and he would begin to write the names that needed returning. The list would be long. The town would be more reluctant to sleep. He would be made necessary in a new way, less useful for smoothing and more necessary for naming. It was not comfort, but it was an answer, and for now that would have to be enough. At the edge of the harbor, a lamp winked out. There was a far-off shout and then a hush. Jonna tightened his grip on Mara's hand, and as they walked into the deeper mist, he felt the small, almost inaudible movement of the world turning towards something unresolved. Jonna had imagined the morning after his decision with a sort of schematic clarity, a series of neat results, a legible accounting of what would return and what would remain. He had thought of the ledger opened on his table like a map he could redraw, and of Elias' backroom emptied of the oddest jars. He had not, he discovered, imagined the small, irregular ways the town would make those consequences felt. He woke with the fog still layered against his window, a thin skin of salt across the glass. For a moment he simply listened, boats answering some distant horn, the hiss of tide against stone, and felt the new looseness in the way the room occupied him. He had expected liberation, perhaps like the air after a storm. Instead there was a fine, relentless ash, as if something inside the house had settled into a new shape and insisted on being known. When he stepped down to the quay he saw it immediately, faces changing as if certain arrangements in them had been altered by unseen hands. They were not always the softened, relieved faces he had become accustomed to producing. For some people the return of a recollection slid like a grain of sand into an old brace. It rattled them in ways that were visible and unglossed. Mrs. Holm pushed her market basket with both hands, knuckles whitened as always. Jonna had traded for her son a year before a life in which the boy's steadiness on the rigging mattered more than the burden that sat behind his motion. When the memory came back to the mother that morning, it did not arrive like a musical note. It came as a throat-closing sense of what she had done, and she stopped in the narrow lane to put her palm flat against the clapboard and breathe. Jonna thought of every hand he had touched in the manner of a craftsman. He had once believed himself, private and small, to be doing a tidy kindness, remove the jaggedness, allow people to smooth themselves into their lives. Now he watched that kindness and saw how it had rerouted more than edges. In Mrs. Holmes' pause there was a recognition, immediate and unclean, that what had been restored would not be neatly understood as wholly good. It was not all regret. In the morning Jonna still found himself occasionally rehearsing other names. As though identity were a garment one tried on, he met Thomas Reed at the fish stalls. The man stopped mid-step when Jonna called his name. For a breath he looked as if someone had taken 5 years off him, and a tenderness entered around his mouth. He clasped Jonna's forearm with something like gratitude and, a little uncertain, said, "Thank you, lad, for helping me remember him." He didn't say more because no more could be said. Memory returned had a borderland where speech felt inadequate. The first days after the decision passed in a stuttering rhythm. People returned to houses they had kept clean of certain recollections and found rooms that were not as they had arranged them. Some set about repairing what had been revealed, letters read aloud, trunks opened, but others sealed themselves away, shocked by their own capacity for sorrow. Jonna moved among these disturbances with the same care he used when handling jars. His hands wanted to be useful in the old way and could not be. Instead he wrote, crossed out, annotated, and experimented with new protocols on the ledger's margins. Old Tilda visited him on the second afternoon with a kettle and a look that had the flatness of someone who had watched many people try to become themselves again. "You did what you could," she said, offering a cup, and when Jonah hesitated as to whether that was praise, she added, "It'll be messier than you think. But cleanliness isn't the point, child. Truth is. Even the bone-deep parts." Her voice had the casual cruelty of someone who loved the truth like a stubborn weed. Jonah did not argue. He had already learned that old Tilda kept no illusions about tidy endings. Elias' retreat was quieter than Jonah expected. There had been a scene in the back room when Jonah had moved through its shelves, tags, the brittle whisper of paper, and he had heard the precise metallic of Elias arranging things as if order might absolve a heart. After Jonah's choice word got out in small ways, Gideon's scruples, a note from Faye slipped, a fragment of ledger left on a bench Elias did not leave in shouts or spectacle. He wrapped jars, slid them into a battered crate, and, in the end, left a few behind to be catalogued by the council's procedural inquiry. One night Jonah watched from across a lane as Elias gathered his bundle and walked toward the western road. Shoulders not bent as in defeat, but as if carrying a weight he could no longer call his own. The town's response was not unanimous. Captain Lazaro sent a short, clipped letter saying that the port required certain steady hands and a certain kind of forgetfulness to function, and he asked for an accounting. He was not hostile, exactly, he was a man looking for an order that would not endanger his crew. Some merchant families wrote that they feared the resurrection of memories would undo commerce. Their letter was formal and edged with a measure of decorum Jonah recognized from many ledgers he himself had once copied. There were other, quieter reckonings. Gideon Pry's face paled at the market one morning. Jonah had not intended cruelty toward the clerk. Gideon had been a human who made choices, but when people saw how the ledger's fragments suggested an industry of extraction, Gideon became, in the distance, a pale thing to be pitied. He left town for a few days. When he returned, he spoke less and moved slower. Faye Corcoran, on the other hand, met Jonah in the shadow of the rope bridge one night and offered him a small, torn envelope. Inside was a list of names, those whose shadows had been catalogued in Elias' deeper shelves. She had risked a good deal to pass it along and paid, in practical ways, for doing so. Elias' apprentices had tightened their circles and watched her more closely. Jonah wanted to thank her more than he knew how. People began to ask for the ledger itself in ways he had never anticipated. They wanted to see how trades had been recorded. Some asked because they wanted to know what had been taken. Others asked because they wanted assurances that, in the future, nothing would be removed without their knowledge. Jonah walked the narrow distance between transparency and the fear of harming private people. His ledger had been, for him, a way of remembering names, dates, the softest description of regret that let him match a new shadow. To put it on a public table would make those intimate descriptions communal. Old Tilda helped him, in small and practical ways, to find a middle ground, consent forms, a rewriting of language at the ledger's margins, a practice of recorded permission. He learned to write differently. He used fewer euphemisms. Instead of listing a sorrow as work-related wear, he asked the person to name the thing in their own voice, and wrote it down as recorded speech. If someone could not name it, they were invited to a different process, a conversation where Jonah's role was not to soften but to listen and to offer options. Those options, even as newly codified, sometimes felt like instruments of danger. Jonah found himself refusing trades, small refusals at first, then firmer because some recollections were not his to move. There were moments of plain gratitude. A woman Jonah had traded for years ago, her name escaped him for a moment. Memory plays tricks in these pages that are not meant to be tricks. Came to the quay and took him by the wrist with both hands. "You gave me room," she said, "and now I have it back." Her eyes were wet with something that looked like relief and like apology at the same time. Jonah did not know whether to answer with the sort of speech he had practiced, short, serviceable, or with the sort of indulgent reassurance people sometimes wanted. He let the silence hold them both, and it felt, absurdly, like a new kind of intimacy. But restoration also brought frictions. In a narrow lane not far from the harbor, a dock worker Jonah had once helped came angry into the market, his face red and words like salt. "You took my wife's memory," he shouted, or rather he shouted at the idea of trades being reversed and at Jonah as the figurehead for flux. Jonah listened with a patience he had learned from old Tilda, palms folded together to show he meant no harm. He said, "I didn't take it. I tried to make a place for you to work." The man did not quiet. He grabbed a rope and walked away hard, leaving the town to choose sides in a dozen small ways that were not, Jonah learned, simply tidy. Mara was steady through all of it. She arrived each morning with a scrap of bread, and sometimes with a look that asked Jonah to be less apologetic to himself. They spoke in the evenings as they had before, but now there were more named words between them: consent, reckoning, responsibility. She would press the palm of her hand to the ledger and say things like, "You can keep the record skeleton, but the people who live in it should be asked first." She was blunt, and the bluntness was both fuel and cure. Jonah sometimes mistook her frankness for impatience, but its steadiness was a salve. Old Tilda and Jonah rewound certain trades on paper, rendering them as histories rather than erasures. Jonah added context to entries that once had been terse. Who had witnessed the consent? What else had been said in the same breath? Whether a person had returned later to ask for restoration. He invented a tiered process. Some shadows could be temporarily softened with explicit consent, tied to a time limit. Others required an extended conversation, witnesses, and a recorded note in the public ledger kept in the town hall for those who consented to such openness. The idea was small and domestic, make memory bearing visible enough so it could be handled rather than trafficked. There were other small, practical reforms. Captain Liz Harrow suggested that certain trades be forbidden for those who worked on dangerous runs without a censure process. The Harbor Council sent a minor official to consult on new regulations. The man walked the quay in stiff shoes and asked Jonah a series of procedural questions as if surveying a warehouse. Jonah answered as honestly as he could. He told them he did not know whether returning a memory was always the right thing. He told them he had been wrong to think he could be a universal healer. He spoke, haltingly, about his own missing shadow without theatrics. There was a hum of interest in the room at the mention of a boy who had no shadow. It was more curiosity than pity, and Jonah found that, in this small confession, he had given the town something it needed. A human face for the work they had been discussing in the abstract. Faye's fate was the sort that belongs to people caught between two loyalties. She had given Jonah names and paid for it by losing a degree of trust with Elias' remaining circle. Jonah watched her at the market, shoulders set as if she were balancing a burden. Once he caught her staring at a ledger page, and he thought he saw gratitude and fear in equal measure. He wanted to say thank you in a way that would not make her feel exposed. Instead, he walked over and patted her shoulder, an almost infantile gesture that made both of them laugh with a sudden self-consciousness. Elias' retreat did not end the need for decisions. Some jars remained on shelves that would be reviewed by the council. Others had been broken, their glass scattered, as if some exchanges had been too nimble to undo. Jonah sometimes woke in the night thinking of the particular tag he had once written. The words, so small they might have been a whisper. It keeps him from calling for her. He had once thought that whisper was a mercy, a way to keep a father working. Now he saw the whisper for what it also was, a removal of a trace that kept human shape. There were future costs Jonah could not, at first, foresee. Some people who had their memories returned delicately and, with consent, found that the memory behaved differently once it reattached. It did not sit like an object put back on a shelf, but sometimes arrived in splinters. A woman who had once been able to fold her grief into a rhythm of cooking could no longer manage the same motion. Another who had had a child's laugh return to him could no longer work a shift without stopping to weep. Jonah watched these changes and had to learn not to measure success in immediate productivity. He had to accept that the moral calculus was not utility but a long view of truth and accountability. Night after night Jonah went back to his room with the ledger. He turned each page with a reverence and a regret, and he tried to imagine how the same pages might be used by people to tell their own stories. He began with old Tilda's help to teach a few others how to keep such records, how to ask, how to record, how to refuse. The work made him feel useful in a new way. It also made him feel exposed. He had less to offer as a bomb in the old sense, and that left him oddly naked before Mara and the town. They ate supper on the rope bridge more than once that week, 2 plates, salt on their lips, rain beginning to feather the lamplight. Mara spoke of her brother and of the hollow that memory had left. Jonah told her bits of what he had changed in the ledger without being precise, his voice low and guarded. "You did not make them suffer to be noble," she said at one point, which meant both that she did not believe him capable of grand malice, and that she wanted him to stop self-flagellating. In the half-light their hands would find each other, not quite as an answer but as a promise to remain near. Toward the end of the week a small envelope arrived at Jonah's table. Inside was a short note from Gideon, written in a hand that had a new hesitancy. "I could not stand that we called it cataloguing. It sounded like worship. I am sorry for what I kept quiet." Jonah folded the paper and read it again, and for the first time in months he felt a lightness that had nothing to do with the missing shadow, and everything to do with the fact that someone else had noticed and said sorry. On the quay a man Jonah had not seen in years paused and asked him a question about the ledger as if it were a map. Jonah explained the new consent practices slowly, and the man nodded with a look of complicated relief and curiosity. "So it's like keeping a habit of telling the truth," he said. "Yes," Jonah answered, "but it's also like learning to carry what you will not be rid of." He had the sense that this was not a final answer, but a small practice he could offer. The week closed on a night of low tide. Jonah walked the quay with the ledger under his arm and the fog thick enough to make the lamps a halo. He found Mara on the rope bridge, braid dark against her collar, and they stood for a while without speaking. Behind them, in a window across the quay, someone had hung an old photograph back on the wall where it had once been taken down. It was a small domestic defiance, a family portrait returned to a mantel. They heard a bell from the town hall, slow and official, and heavy with the promise of some public gathering. Jonah's stomach constricted. The council would meet. There would be questions and votes, and perhaps a kind of public acid that could sear as much as cleans. He thought of Elias in his layers of gray and of Gideon's small, culpable hand and of Faye's ink-smudged fingers. He thought of old Tilda's kettle and of Captain List's clipped letter. Mara caught his sleeve. "You'll go?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, yet the ledger under his arm felt heavier now with decisions already made. He had nothing to sell, not in the old sense. He had a record and a voice, and something he had learned to call a moral practice. "I'll go," he said. The bell sounded again, and its note rolled over the water like something that wanted to be answered. Jonah held Mara's hand and for a second allowed himself the private thought that perhaps being known was, after all, the point. Then he folded the ledger to himself and walked toward the town hall, the lamp-misted quay bending around him in a hush of expectation. The decision had been made. Now there would be a reckoning that would be public and unadorned. Jonah straightened his shoulders and walked on, the ledger against his ribs like a heart. The meeting would be tomorrow. The town would decide how public mercy should be, and whether memory might be something to steward rather than to trade. Jonah could not say how it would end. He could only take one step at a time and keep the pages warm with his hands. And still, late as he lay awake, he found himself waiting less for his own shadow than for the moment when someone would stand in the hall and say, aloud, what it felt like to have a memory returned. He wanted to hear the sound of the town admitting its faults aloud. because he believed, in a way that frightened him, that truth in the open might be the only way to keep the harbor from hardening into a place where sorrow was only currency. The next day would ask the town to answer that. Jonah turned his face into the small dark and waited for dawn. Jonah had always thought of his ledger as a private thing. It was, in his mind, a small, red-bound rule-book written in a hand that trembled only when the weather did. He had kept it because memory without a record was a slippery thing. He had taught himself to write down not only names and exchanges, but the ways shadows sat in a room, the precise notes of a regret sharp or blunted, a spatter of rage, a long dull ache and the ritual that had softened it. He had put faith in that carefulness the way others put faith in nets or in the logic of tides, as an instrument for survival, for measured, practical charity. So the call to the harbor council felt, for Jonah, like a sudden widening of the ledger from a page to a table as big as the quay. The chamber where they had asked him to come was an old room above the customs house, a long table that had seen votes about mooring rights and fish tariffs, and until recently, not about the things that followed a person at dusk. The committee sat with papers and tea and a sensible air. They had asked for witnesses. The town had provided merchants with their ledgered complaints, a captain with a bitter voice, a mother with a husband who could sleep now. Jonah had expected subcommittee curiosity, perhaps an admonition from the harbor master. He had not expected to feel naked. He arrived early, as he had lately arrived anywhere too early, and with a sense of his habits not fitting the occasion. The room smelled of boiled tea and old wood and the faint tang of tar from a coat hung carelessly on a peg. Mara was there before him, as she often was for such things. She had a loaf wrapped in oilcloth and the steady, tied rope about her wrist that had always been a kind of promise. Old Tilda sat at the back, small and solid as a stone in the harbor, her hands in her lap. Mrs. Holm hovered near the doorway, fingers worrying a handkerchief. Captain Lazaro came in later, coated with a quiet grievance like salt on skin. Elias Venn was there, too, not in the formal way the council had requested but as a member of the public. He had declined to give evidence but had not declined to sit where he might hear. Jonah felt the weight of his closed notebook across his knees like an accusation. The council clerk called names and the room took on the rhythm of civic deliberation. A local grain merchant spoke first, his voice middle-aged and raw with self-importance. He told a story of a delayed cargo. The helmsman forgot the turning lane, he said. It cost us 3 days and 2 crates. When a man cannot remember the line of his night, it becomes business. He tapped the table with a gloved finger. Another merchant spoke of a dispute between neighbors, a seam in a town that had once been held by shared grievance, now sutured by forgetting. Captain List's testimony was shorter, harder. It's simple, he said. When a sailor can't remember a ledge, he is a hazard. When he can't remember whether he swore that oath, then his sense of duty rots. We can't run a port by sentiment. His words were not unkind. They were the language of someone who had to measure risk in cargo holds and crew. No one in the chamber seemed to doubt the practical point. Jonah listened as his own work was reframed in ledger terms, losses, costs, liabilities. Mrs. Holm rose at the next prompt, her voice small, and reminded the room of softer things. She spoke, haltingly, of nights when her son would wake in a sweat, and remember the thing that had kept him from his children's beds. He had been cruel then, she said, but their household had kept together because she could help him soften the sharpness. It made things possible, she said, and her voice carried. We repaired what would have split us. Jonah felt, at that point, the room shift along an axis he had not noticed. The debate was not merely about whether a trade had caused a delay on a quay, but whether a trade had allowed a family to remain intact. When the clerk turned to call Jonah, he found himself unsteady in a way the ledger's loss had not previously allowed him. He had expected to be asked to explain technique, how a shadow was loosened, how he chose replacements, but the questions, as they came, were steadier and narrower. The chair of the council asked him about consent. How did he ensure a person understood what they were being offered? Another member asked whether he kept records. A third asked whether he had ever refused a trade. These were the kinds of questions his ledger had been built to answer. Jonah spoke slowly. He kept his eyes lowered more than he ordinarily would, but he made himself look up when he had to. I asked them to say it aloud, he told them. Not just a promise, but a telling of what they'd like gone. I tell them what I think I can do soften the edges, and what I think I cannot. I don't know how to make regret disappear without making them into strangers to what they did. I write what I do down so I can go back to it if needed. He felt his own hands tremble as he spoke the last sentence and imagined, for a moment, his neat ledger unwinding inward. Someone asked whether people always consented. Jonah remembered, in that pause, the woman on the quay who had signed under pressure, because she thought it would keep her son employed. The widow who had not thought at all they had all been willing in different and complicated ways. People consent, yes, he said, but consent is not always free of desperation. I ask for time when I can give it. We try to make it a ritual so that choosing is visible. He tried to explain the evening of light small lamps people left in windows as a symbol that they had given permission, but it felt like explaining a private liturgy in a formal court. Elias listened without expression. When the clerk asked him to comment, he only said, quietly, that cataloging had its uses, and that if the town wished to preserve its stories for future generations, an archive was sensible. Forgetting can be contagious, he said. We set together what to remember, so that the rest of us will not be left adrift. His voice was the voice of a man who had slept among papers, and had allowed himself to believe that arrangement could be a substitute for mourning. The arguments unfolded with the slow logic of tides. There were points made for regulation, mandatory records, public oversight, a register of trades, counter-arguments about paternalism, about the right of a household to handle grief as it chose. Captain List's practical examples were balanced by Mrs. Holmes' softer ones. Old Tilda, when she was called, did not grandstand. She told a short story of a midwifery that had been preserved by someone remembering, and of another event where a woman had nearly been robbed of a story that turned out, later, to be the shape of a child's small surprise. We cannot tidy grief like a cupboard, she said, nor can we leave it on the floor to trip the rest of us. There must be care. At one point Gideon Price shifted in his chair in the room, like Jonah, noticed how the clerk had the ledger with Elias' neat hand in it, neat entries, dates as if they were teeth. The council murmured. A member asked whether there had been removals of shadows outside of the consensual rituals Jonah described. Gideon did not speak. Elias cleared his throat and, in a voice not unkind, argued that an archive would, if properly administered, offer a way to restore what had been desperate. We can return what has been misplaced, he offered, if the town will allow me space and trust. The offer landed like a stone into a shallow pond. The ripples were not all in the same direction. Some members of the council liked the efficient solution: preserve, and then restore. Others, thinking of power and who would keep keys in their hands, recoiled. The question the debate could not make into a single, clean sentence was this: who should be allowed to decide what counts as a memory worth keeping intact? And under what conditions could a town authorize the softening of grief? Jonah's testimony, such as it was, seemed to shift the balance not merely by what he said but by the feel it left. He did not ask for absolution. He described small things: the way a softened shadow let a mother sleep, the way a sailor's face smoothed, and yet sometimes lost a sharpness that had warned others. He told them of his ledger and why he had kept it. When a councilman accused him of being an amateur mediator of a very intimate thing, Jonah answered that he had learned in practice, and he named the rituals he tried to observe. His voice, tight as a knot, did not bend to righteousness or to denial. I have been trying, he said at one point. I have tried to make what I do accountable in the ways I could. I have not always seen the bigger effect, and for that I am sorry. There was a hush. Jonah felt his chest loosen a little. He had expected denouncement but had instead encountered the small, sharp mercy of being understood as fallible. Mara's hand on the bench beside him was warm and firm. She had not leaned in the whole time, but her presence steadied him. When the votes were called, they did not send the matter away with the